She was 18 and homeless. No family, no savings. Just $10 folded inside a torn envelope. And somehow she spent every last cent of it on an abandoned lighthouse on the edge of a cliff. People in town said she'd lost her mind. They said the place was cursed, that no one had set foot inside for 30 years. What they didn't know was that the lighthouse she bought for $10 was hiding something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. On the day she turned 18, Clara Whitfield walked out of the Garfield County group home with a plastic bag in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. The plastic bag held everything she owned. 2 shirts, a pair of jeans with a hole in the left knee, a toothbrush, and a small wooden picture frame with a photograph of a woman she barely remembered. Her mother. The manila envelope had arrived 3 days earlier, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. The return address was a law office in a town she'd never heard of, Ngorongoro, Oregon. She hadn't opened it yet. Something about the weight of it, the formality of it, made her want to wait. The morning air was cold and damp. The sky hung low over the small town like a gray wool blanket. The kind that doesn't warm you, just presses down. Clara stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking at the building she had just walked out of. It was an old two-story house, converted into a group home for foster kids who had aged out of placements. She had lived there for almost 3 years, which was longer than she had lived anywhere. Now, she was legally an adult, which meant one thing. She was no longer anyone's responsibility. Clara walked to the bus stop at the end of the block and sat on the cold metal bench. She pulled the envelope from her bag and turned it over in her hands. And slowly, she tore it open. Inside was a single typed letter, a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper, and a small brass key taped to a piece of cardboard. The letter was short. It said that a man named Henry Whitfield, her maternal grandfather, had passed away 7 months earlier. He had left behind a single piece of property on the coast of Oregon, a decommissioned lighthouse and the 2 acres of coastal land it sat on. The property had been abandoned for over 30 years. It owed $10 in back taxes. If she wanted to claim it, she needed to pay the $10 at the county assessor's office in Cape Morrow and present the key. $10. Clara read the letter again. She read it a 3rd time. She had never met her grandfather. Her mother had mentioned him once or twice when Clara was very small before she disappeared. She remembered the word lighthouse, spoken softly like it was a part of a bedtime story. She had always assumed her mother made it up. A lighthouse by the sea, a tall white tower standing at the edge of the world. But here it was, in black ink on legal paper. The lighthouse was real, and it was hers for $10. Clara looked inside her wallet. She had $43. She looked at the bus schedule posted to the side of the bench. There was a Greyhound that went to the coast. Fare to Cape Morrow was $31. She did the math slowly. $31 for the bus, $10 for the taxes. That would leave her $2. $2 and a key to a place she'd never seen, in a town she'd never visited, left to her by a man she'd never met. For a long time, Clara just sat there staring at the map. It showed a thin road winding along a coastline, past a small town ending at a point of land that jutted out into the ocean. At the tip of the point, someone had drawn a small circle and written one word beside it in faded pencil. Home? She folded the map, put it back in the envelope, and stood up. When the bus came 20 minutes later, she climbed on, paid the fare, and watched through the window as the town she'd known for 3 years slowly disappeared behind her. The ride to Cape Morrow took almost 5 hours. The bus was mostly empty. An elderly couple sat near the front sharing a bag of trail mix. A man in a work jacket leapt with his chin on his chest. Clara sat in the back row with her forehead pressed against the cool glass. She thought about all the places she had lived since she was 6 years old. 5 foster homes, 2 group placements, a shelter for 3 weeks one winter when a placement fell through. She had learned it early, not to unpack completely, not to put things on shelves or hang pictures on walls. Those were things people did when they planned to stay. And Clara had never planned to stay anywhere because no one had ever planned to keep her. She slept for a while. She dreamed of water. Not the ocean. Not yet. But rain. Soft, steady rain falling on the roof of a house she didn't recognize. Somewhere warm and safe and quiet. There was a window in the dream, and through the window she could see the rain falling on tall grass. Someone was standing beside her, but she couldn't see their face. They were saying something she couldn't quite hear. Something important. When she opened her eyes, the landscape had changed. The flat brown fields were gone, replaced by thick green forest pressing close to the road. Ferns grew in thick carpets beneath the trees. Moss covered every surface, the trunks, the rocks, even the guardrails along the road. The air smelled different even through the closed window, wet and sharp and alive. She could feel the ocean before she saw it. A kind of heaviness in the air, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, through a gap in the trees, she caught her first glimpse of it. The Pacific Ocean, gray and enormous, and stretching out to the edge of the sky. Clara pressed her face against the glass. She had never seen the ocean before, not in person. She had seen it in photographs, in movies, on postcards and gas stations, but nothing had prepared her for the size of it. It was like looking at the sky turned sideways. Endless and moving and impossibly wide. The bus pulled into Cape Morrow just after 300 in the afternoon. It was a small town. A single main street lined with low wooden buildings. A hardware store, a diner with a faded awning, a post office, a bait shop. Fishing nets hung drying on wooden racks behind the bait shop. A black dog slept on the sidewalk outside the diner. The kind of town where everyone knows, everyone and strangers are noticed immediately. Clara stepped off the bus and stood on the sidewalk holding her plastic bag in her envelope. A man coming out of the hardware store glanced at her, then looked away. She found the county assessor's office, 2 blocks down in a small brick building next to the fire station. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked at the letter, then at Clara, then at the letter again. "You're Henry's granddaughter." Clara nodded. The woman studied her for a moment. Not unkindly, but carefully, the way you look at someone before deciding whether to tell them the truth. "Sweetheart, you know that property hasn't been touched in over 30 years. The Lighthouse was decommissioned in 1991. Henry lived out there alone for a while after that. But he stopped maintaining it years ago. The roof leaks. The stairs might not be safe. There's no electricity, no running water. The road out to the point washes out every winter." Clara set the $10 on the counter. "I'd like to claim it, please." The woman looked at the $10 bill for a long moment. Then she sighed, pulled out a form, and began to type. 20 minutes later, Clara walked out of the assessor's office holding a deed. The paper felt heavier than it should have. She stood on the sidewalk and looked west toward the ocean she could hear, but not yet see. It took her almost 2 hours to walk to the lighthouse. The road started as cracked pavement, then turned to gravel, then to packed dirt with grass growing through the middle. The forest pressed, enclosed on both sides. Tall, dark pines with branches that swayed and creaked in the wind. She could smell salt in the air, stronger with every step. When the trees finally opened up, Clara stopped walking. The lighthouse stood at the end of a rocky point, alone against the sky. It was taller than she'd imagined, maybe 60 ft built of thick, white-painted brick that had faded and cracked over the decades. Patches of dark moss clung to the north side. The iron gallery railing at the top was rusted almost black. The lantern room at the very top was dark, its glass panels clouded and cracked. Thick green ivy had climbed halfway up the tower, gripping the bricks like fingers. At the base of the lighthouse was a small attached keeper's cottage, a single-story stone building with a slate roof and 2 windows, both broken. The wooden front door hung slightly open, rocking gently in the wind. Behind the lighthouse, the cliff dropped away sharply. Far below, the ocean threw itself against the rocks in slow, heavy waves, sending white spray into the air. The sound was enormous and constant, like breathing. Clara walked toward the door. Her heart was beating hard. She pulled out the brass and held it up. It was old and slightly green with tarnish. She pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. The keeper's cottage was a single large room. The floor was a stone, covered in dust and dried leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, its mantel cracked, but still solid. An old wooden table sat in the center of the room, 2 of its legs broken, leaning at an angle. Against one wall was a rusted iron bed frame with no mattress. Everything was gray, with dust and age. Clara set her bag down and looked around slowly. The air smelled like salt and old wood and something else, something faintly sweet like dried flowers. Light came in through the broken windows in pale shafts, catching the dust motes drifting through the still air. It was cold. It was empty. It was falling apart. But it had walls. It had a roof, mostly, and it was hers. She walked to the back of the cottage where a heavy wood entered lead into the base of the lighthouse tower. She pushed it open. Inside was a narrow circular room with a spiral iron staircase winding upward into darkness. The stairs were rusted, but Clara put her hand on the railing and looked up. Far above, a faint circle of gray light marked the top of the tower. She began to climb. The stairs groaned and echoed with each step. The walls were curved and close, made of the same thick brick as the outside. Small windows appeared every full rotation, each one offering a wider view of the ocean as she climbed higher. The wind got louder. The air got colder. On the 3rd landing, about 40 ft up, Clara stopped. Something caught her eye. A section of the brick wall looked different from the rest, newer somehow, or at least placed differently. The mortar between the bricks was a slightly different color, lighter, more yellow than the gray mortar everywhere else. She pressed her hand against it. The bricks shifted slightly. Clara's breath caught. She pressed harder. One brick moved inward about half an inch. She pulled at the edges and slowly, carefully worked the brick free. Behind it was a dark cavity in the wall. She reached inside. Her fingers closed around something made of cloth. She pulled it out carefully. It was a canvas bag, small, about the size of a loaf of bread, tied shut with a piece of twine. It was surprisingly heavy. Clara sat down on the iron stairs and untied the twine with trembling fingers. She pulled one free and unrolled it. Money, $20 bills, old ones, with small faces and fine green engraving. She counted the first roll. 50 bills, $1,000. Clara stared at the money in her hands, and she looked back at the hole in the wall. She reached in again. There were more bags. She pulled out a second one, then a third. Each one was the same, heavy canvas tied with twine, filled with the tightly rolled bundles of cash. She counted them all sitting there on the cold iron stairs, with the wind howling through the cracks in the tower. 7 bags, each one containing between $3,000 and $5,000 old bills, $27,000. Clara sat very still for a long time. The money spread out on the stairs around her, the empty bags lying flat. The wind pushed through the lighthouse tower, making a low moaning sound that rose and fell like a voice. At the bottom of the last bag, she found something else. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. She opened it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten in shaky blue ink. Clara, if you're reading this, then you found your way here. I always hoped you would. This money is from the years I spent keeping the light. I saved what I could, a little at a time, for the day you might need it. The lighthouse is old, but it is strong. The walls are 3 feet thick. The foundation goes down to bedrock. It has stood here for 114 years, through storms that took everything else. Build your life here. The sea will teach you patience. The wind will teach you strength. I'm sorry I could not be there, but I was always here keeping the light for you. Your grandfather, Henry. Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. She sat on those cold iron stairs and cried. Not from sadness, not from joy, but from something in between. The feeling of being found after a very long time of being lost. She didn't move for a while. The ocean roared below. The wind circled the tower, and slowly the light inside the lighthouse began to change. The gray afternoon fading into the softer gold of early evening. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something you weren't expecting? The next morning, Clara woke up on the stone floor of the keeper's cottage wrapped in the only jacket she owned. The fire she'd managed to start in the old fireplace had burned down to embers. Through the broken windows, she could see the ocean, silver and flat under a pale sky. She had $27,000. It was more money than she had ever held in her life, than she had ever imagined having. She understood, even then, that it was not a fortune, was a chance. A carefully measured chance saved up $20 at a time over decades by an old man in a lighthouse who had never stopped thinking about a granddaughter he'd never met. She would not waste it. Clara walked into Cape Morrow that morning and bought supplies at the hardware store. Plastic sheeting and duct tape for the broken windows, a broom, a mop, a bucket, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, basic tools, a handsaw, a set of screwdrivers, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, canned food enough for 2 weeks. She spent $340 and carried it all back into trips. The first week was cleaning. She swept out years of leaves, dirt, and debris from the cottage floor. She scrubbed the stone with water she hauled from a freshwater spring she found about 200 yards inland, trickling out of a mossy rock face. She taped plastic sheeting over the broken windows to stop the wind. She tested every step of the spiral staircase, marking the ones that felt weak with strips of duct tape. The second week was repairs, where she replaced the broken legs of the old wooden table using branches she cut from a fallen pine tree. She patched the places where the cottage roof leaked with the remaining plastic sheeting and some roofing tar she bought in town. She cleaned out the fireplace chimney using a long branch with rags tied to the end, pushing it up through the flue until the smoke drew cleanly. By the end of the first month, the cottage was livable. Not comfortable, not finished, but livable. The floor was clean. The fire worked. The windows kept out the wind. She had a sleeping bag, a table, and a working door. The townspeople noticed. A few of them had driven out to the point to see what was happening. Word had spread quickly that someone was living in old Henry Whitfield's lighthouse. A girl barely 18, all by herself. Most people shook their heads. The woman from the assessor's office told anyone who asked that the girl would be gone before winter. The owner of the hardware store said she seemed determined, but probably didn't know what she was getting into. Clara didn't pay attention to any of it. She had work to do. The second month, she taught herself basic plumbing from a book she found at the town's small library. The library was a single room at the back of the town hall with metal shelves and a card catalog that still used paper cards. The librarian, an older man with white hair and a quiet voice, didn't say much when Clara came in the first time. He just watched her walk to the home repair section and pull down 3 books. When she came back the next week for more, he had already set aside a stack for her. Wiring, roofing, masonry. He never asked what she was doing, or he didn't need to. She ran a pipe from the fresh water spring to the cottage using PVC pipe she bought at the hardware store. It took her 3 days to dig the trench, working with a shovel and a picask she borrowed from the library's toll-lending program. The soil near the cliff was thin and rocky, and her hands blistered badly the first day. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept digging. When she finally connected the fittings and turned the valve and water flowed into the stone sink she'd mounted against the cottage wall. She stood there watching it for 10 minutes straight. Running water. Her own running water. The first time in her life, she had turned on a tap in a place that belonged to her. She fixed the windows next. The glass got to size at the hardware store. The owner, used a heavy man named Gus who wore the same flannel shirt every day, showed her how to measure twice and score the glass with a dime and tipped cutter. He didn't charge her for the lesson. She installed the windows herself, learning as she went, pressing glazing putty into the frames with her thumb. It took 2 days, and she had to redo one pane that cracked when she pressed too hard. But when the last window was in, and she stood back and looked at the cottage from outside, she noticed something. The cottage filled with light for the first time in 30 years. Real light, warm and steady, pouring through clean glass. By the 3rd month, Clara had begun working on the lighthouse tower itself. She repaired the weakest stairs on the spiral staircase, replacing rusted iron bolts with new ones, reinforcing treads with steel brackets she bent herself using a vise she found in the back of the keeper's cottage, buried under a pile of old rope. She cleaned every window in the tower. She scrubbed the walls with a wire brush and soapy water. She swept every landing. Dead birds, mouse nests, 30 years of accumulated debris went into trash bags, and then into the burn pile she kept behind the cottage. At the top, in the lantern room, she stood for a long time looking out at the ocean. The view stretched forever, blue and gray and silver depending on the light. She could see the curve of the coastline, the dark edge of the forest, the town far in the distance. Seabirds circled below her, riding the updraft from the cliffs. The old Fresnel lens was still there, dusty and cracked but not broken. It was enormous, a bar of thick glass cylinder nearly 4 feet tall, made of concentric glass prisms arranged in a pattern that could focus a small flame into a beam visible for miles. Clara had read about these lenses in the Lighthouse history book from the library. They were invented by a French physicist in the 1800s. Some of them were so perfectly made that they could take the light of a single oil lamp and turn it into a beam visible 20 miles out to sea. This one was a third-order lens, one of the most common in coastal lighthouses. It had guided ships along the Oregon coast for over a century. Clara cleaned it carefully with soft cloths, piece by piece, working slowly so she wouldn't chip the old glass. It took her 3 full days. But when the last prism was clean and the afternoon sun hit the lens for the first time in decades, the entire lantern room exploded with light. Rainbows crawled across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Beams of concentrated sunlight shot out through the glass panels in every direction. Clara stood there in the middle of it, surrounded by color, and laughed out loud. It was the first time she had laughed like that in as long as she could remember. She didn't have the equipment to actually light the lighthouse. The original lamp mechanism had been removed decades ago by the Coast Guard. But sometimes on foggy nights, she would carry a lantern up the spiral stairs and set it inside the old lens. The light would catch and magnify and throw a soft glow out into the fog. Not bright enough to guide ships, but bright enough to be seen from shore. A small warm light in the darkness, steady and patient like a heartbeat. After people in town began to talk about it, they said the lighthouse was lit again. Some of the older residents, the ones who remembered Henry Whitfield, said it was about time. Others said the girl was just playing pretend. But on foggy nights, the fishermen coming home late would see that glow on the cliff, and more than one of them admitted, quietly, that it was a comfort. By the 6th month, Clara had transformed the keeper's cottage into a small, but genuine home. She had built a simple wooden bed frame from lumber she bought in town, and a mattress she found on sale at a thrift store 20 miles up the coast, which she carried the last mile on her back. She had installed a small propane stove for cooking. She had shelves on the walls built from driftwood she collected from the beach below, sanded smooth and mounted with brackets. The shelves were filled with books from the library's free pile. She had curtains on the windows, sewn by hand from fabric she found at a second-hand shop. The stitches were uneven, but they held. There was a rug on the stone floor, a kettle on the stove, and a rocking chair she had repaired and placed by the window that looked out at the ocean. The cottage was warm. It smelled like wood smoke and saltire and pine. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace through the glass windows she had installed herself. She could watch the ocean change color with the sky. She had spent just under $9,000 of the $27,000 her grandfather had left her. The rest she kept in a bank account in town, the first bank account she had ever opened. The seasons turned. Summer came, and the cliff was covered in wildflowers, yellow and purple and white, all bending in the constant breeze. Fall brought storms that shook the lighthouse tower and sent waves crashing over the rocks, so hard the spray reached the cottage door. Clara boarded up what needed boarding, reinforced what needed reinforcing, and sat by her fire reading while the rain hammered the roof. Winter was hard. The wind off the ocean was relentless and sharp. Some nights the temperature dropped below freezing, and she fed the fire every 2 hours to keep the cottage warm. The wood she had stockpiled in the fall, dragging fallen branches from the forest and splitting them with a hand axe, burned faster than she expected. She learned to bank the fire with ash at night so the coals lasted longer. She learned to stuff rags into the cracks around the door frame. She learned that wool socks were more important than almost anything. There were nights when the storm was so loud she couldn't sleep. The wind screamed around the lighthouse tower like something alive. Rain hammered the slate roof, so hard it sounded like gravel. The ocean below was a roaring darkness. invisible but enormous. On those nights, Clara would wrap herself in her sleeping bag beside the fire and read by the flickering light. She had worked her way through most of the library's free pile by now. Mysteries, old westerns, gardening books, a history of Oregon lighthouses that she read 3 times. But the walls were thick, the windows held, and the chimney drew clean. She was cold sometimes, but she was safe. And more than safe, she was home. On those cold nights, she would sometimes climb the spiral staircase and sit in the lantern room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the storm. Here, the glass was old and rattled in the wind, but it held. Below her, the ocean was black and churning, the waves invisible except for the white lines of foam that appeared and disappeared in the darkness. The lighthouse swayed ever so slightly in the strongest gusts. She could feel it in her body, a faint rocking like being on a boat. It had done this for 114 years. It would do it for 114 more. One night in February, during the worst storm of the winter, Clara heard knocking at the cottage door. She opened it to find Gus from the hardware store standing in the rain holding a box. Inside was a kerosene heater, a bag of oranges, and a note that said, "From the folks in town." Clara stood in the doorway holding the box while the rain soaked the threshold. She didn't know what to say. She'd never been the kind of person people thought slowly. First the rain softened, then the wind lost its edge. One morning, she stepped outside and heard birds singing in the pine trees, a sound she hadn't heard in months. The cliff turned green almost overnight, wild grass and early wildflowers pushing up through the thin soil. Clara planted a small garden on the sheltered side of the cottage using seeds she ordered from a catalog. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, lettuce. She built a low stone wall around it to protect it from the wind, carrying rocks up from the beach one at a time. She hauled seaweed from the rocks below the cliff and mixed it into the soil, the way a gardening book said to do. The soil was poor and sandy, but the seaweed helped. One morning in late April, she was working in the garden when she heard footsteps on the dirt road. She looked up. It was the woman from the assessor's office walking carefully over the rough ground in rubber boots, carrying a covered dish. "I brought you a casserole," the woman said. She stood at the edge of the garden, looking at the cottage, the repaired windows, the clean walls, the smoke rising from the chimney. Her expression was difficult to read. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to respect. "You actually did it," the woman said quietly. Clara wiped her hands on her jeans and took the dish. "Thank you," she said. The woman looked up at the lighthouse, its white paint still patchy and faded, but cleaner now, standing straight and solid against the blue sky. "Henry would have liked this," she said. He always said someone would come," for she didn't trust her voice to say anything more. That evening, she sat on her wooden bench outside the cottage door and ate the casserole while the sun went down over the ocean. The sky turned pink, then orange, then deep purple. The lighthouse cast a long shadow across somewhere below. The waves rolled in and out, steady and patient, the way they had for thousands of years. Clara looked at the lighthouse, her lighthouse, the place everyone said was worthless, the place no one wanted, the place that had been waiting, silent and strong, for 30 years until someone came along who was willing to see what it could be. She thought about her grandfather, the old man she had never met, who had climbed these same stairs, watched these same sunsets, here listened to the same ocean, who had saved money for decades, $20 at a time, and hidden it in the walls of a lighthouse for a granddaughter he hoped would one day find her way here. She thought about the letter. "Build your life here. Wind will teach you strength." He was right about all of it. The sea had taught her patience. She had learned to wait for low tide to collect seaweed. She had learned to watch the weather and read the clouds before deciding what work to do that day. She had learned that some things, the garden, the repairs, the slow process of turning a ruin into a home, couldn't be rushed. They happened at their own pace, and the only thing she could do was show up every day and keep working. The wind had taught her strength, not the kind of strength that comes from lifting heavy things, though she had done plenty of that, but the kind that comes from standing still when everything around you is trying to push you sideways. The kind that comes from choosing to stay when every sensible person would have left. The kind that comes from saying, "This is my place," and meaning 'cause that's the thing about lighthouses, they don't move, they don't chase anything. They just stand there, steady and quiet, doing the one thing they were built to do, shining a light in the dark so that someone somewhere can find their way. And sometimes, that's exactly what a person needs. Not a fortune, not a miracle, not someone to rescue them. Just a place to stand, a place to begin, a light to follow when everything else has gone dark. The world is full of places that people have given up on. Old buildings, forgotten land, empty rooms that no one thinks are worth saving. And the world is full of people like that too. People who have been overlooked, underestimated, written off before they even had a chance to show what they could do. But value isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's hidden in the walls. Sometimes it takes someone willing to look past what everyone else sees and imagine what could be there instead. Clara Whitfield was 18 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a lighthouse. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments what's something you've built from nothing. Okay. We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.